Welcome to part 7 of the S&A training series. In this last video of the series, we will discuss how to interpret the network maps and identify next steps. To help you interpret your network maps, we will first discuss some key considerations. The first consideration is selective integration. It is important for organizations to be connected together to function well as a system. However, this does not mean that everyone needs to be connected with everyone else. That would be quite inefficient and resource intensive. Instead, network links must be integrated and appropriate, which ties are important to have in regard to the work of the network. One S&A measure that can be helpful in considering how integrated the system is density. Density is the proportion of all possible ties that are actually present. The image on the lower left is a network with low density, and the one on the right is one with high density. Too low of density and the network is fragmented, not connected together as one. However, highly dense networks are inefficient and can inhibit the flow of new ideas and approaches because everyone is connected to each other and groupthink might occur in that situation. There is no magic number or density range. Instead, how dense or integrated the network should be depends on what the network is trying to achieve and the type of activity. For instance, it is important for there to be multiple paths for information to flow to prevent bottlenecks or information not being shared across the system. However, not everyone needs to joint plan together, and the goal may be ensuring enough ties to connect different groups when it comes to joint planning, thus a less dense network than information sharing. A second key consideration is stability. The value of networks is their flexibility, allowing organizations to come and go, engage when and where they can. However, without a certain level of stability, they are difficult to sustain and vulnerable. The key is stability at the core or center of the network, but flexibility at the periphery. Having a steady group of organizations able to keep efforts moving forward allows for a broader group of organizations to come in and out as they are able. Another S&A measure valuable and linked to stability is centralization. Centralization is how reliant the network is on central nodes. The visual below the star or hub and spoke image represents 100% centralization. Other than the central yellow square, for any other square to access another, then they would have to go through the yellow square. Such a structure offers a great deal of stability. Squares can be added or removed without impacting the structure, with the exception of the yellow square. The network is 100% reliant on that yellow square connecting the network. Therefore, this structure provides stability, but there is also vulnerability in its reliance on the one square. Networks rarely have a star or hub and spoke structure. Instead, centralization can be thought of as whether a network is closer to this structure or closer to a less centralized and usually highly dense structure. In addition, there are different types of centralized structures. This image depicts a centralized structure, though not very dense, because it is centralized through a hub structure. 3 different hubs providing most of the connections: the large yellow diamond, red diamond, and yellow triangle. In contrast, this network is also highly centralized, but rather than reliant on only 1 or 2 actors acting as hub, instead there is a strong core. This core is made up of a number of organizations at the center. This type of structure provides stability to the network, but at the same time is more resilient than the other structure because the structure is reliant on a group of actors rather than only a few. Density and centralization and stability and integration provide us with some concepts that can be used to identify strengths and weaknesses in our network maps. One first strength to consider is who are the central actors. Over-reliance on central actors can be a weakness of the structure, as I mentioned with the last slide, but at the same time it is important to recognize the need for and value of central actors. These are also actors that may be very valuable to help strengthen the network, so you should consider having central actors as valuable, especially if they are actors committed to your network efforts. A second strength to consider is whether there are clusters. Are there groups of actors with many organizations among them already? Like among the green organizations in the circle. Such clusters suggest groups already working closely together, providing a foundation off of which your network efforts can build. And then last, do you notice any important ties? The important ties could be any of the connections that may be necessary for your network efforts, like ties between different groups. Here I have circled another cluster, but this time the cluster depicts ties between the different colored shapes, thus ties between organizations in different service areas in this example. These important ties don't have to be a cluster. They could even be a single connection between two actors, like two influential actors, or an example of an innovative systems-oriented relationship that might inspire others. Those important ties can be leveraged for your efforts or again provide a foundation on which you can build more ties. In addition to noting the strength, you do of course want to extract the weaknesses of the network. The first most obvious weakness are the isolates. Isolates are the actors at the top left of the image here. They are lined up in this way because they are not connected to any other actors. Having unconnected or isolated actors is of course a weakness to address. It may be completely reasonable that those actors are unconnected. For instance, they could be actors that have not been considered part of the system, like businesses. Perhaps the goal of your network efforts is to engage those actors and bring them into the system. But recognizing that those actors have not been engaged yet is important to note. A second weakness would be fragments or tails. The image on the bottom left offers an example of a fragment, two organizations connected to each other but not connected to the rest of the network. The image on the top right offers an example of a tail. The concern about the tail is that the removal of any one of the actors in the line would result in a fragment or isolates, thus tenuous connections to the rest of the network. These tenuous connections are especially the case if the tail is connected through weak ties rather than strong or robust multiplex ties. Building connections to the fragment or to the actors in the tail can be important to strengthen their connection with the others in the system. Another weakness to look for are vulnerable hubs. I mentioned before that central actors can be considered strength, but it is important to also consider the vulnerability created by an over-reliance on certain hubs. In the example to the right, there is a group of blue shapes connected together via a hub. Again, as long as this hub continues to play that connecting role, then connecting those other actors together strengthens the network. But what must be considered is if that hub discontinues playing that role. This new image shows what happens to that group of blue shapes if that hub was removed. The group disappears and several of the blue shapes now become isolates. The last weakness to keep in mind is closure. Closure is when you have a group of actors all connected to one another through strong ties, like in the image at the bottom here. Again, closure offers many positives to a network, actors already working closely with one another. But why it could also be considered a weakness is if this group is closed, and that because they are already working closely together, they may be resistant to working with other actors or groups, or closed to the ideas offered by other actors or groups. Whether that group is closed to expanding their ties or expanding their ideas cannot be deciphered from the network plots. Rather, the point is to identify any structures that suggest whether that is a possibility, and thus help identify whether there might be potential barriers to your network efforts or challenges that you will need to address. Before getting into interpreting the strengths and weaknesses of your network, I want to remind you of a couple of pitfalls we have already discussed. First, as a reminder, the plot should be seen as a tool that can provide a common way to visualize the network and identify leverage points and challenges. The network plots, especially the plots produced from the network mapping activity used in this training series, should not be taken as fact, but rather as rough sketches that can provide insights about the structure of the system. Second, the key is not to focus on specific organizations and where they are positioned in the network. Instead, the focus should be on the overall structure and what that overall structure says about the functioning of the system. Now that we have discussed some key considerations and pitfalls in interpreting network maps, it is your turn to interpret the map you produced from the previous activity. In groups, and in considering the identified network strategy in your network maps, answer the following questions. What are the strengths of the network? Are there valuable relationships that can be leveraged? Are there strong clusters to build on? Are there central organizations that can be relied on? After discussing the strengths, identify weaknesses. Are there isolated organizations? Are there unconnected fragments or tails? Is there too much centralization and reliance on certain hubs? Are there closed clusters that may be too siloed? In addition to the structural weaknesses, examine who or what may be missing. Are key players missing? Are there important ties missing? These ties could be missing weak ties, missing strong ties, or missing connections altogether. How important are the missing actors or ties? And finally, based on your discussion in response to all of these questions, what vulnerabilities might the plot suggest about the system? What vulnerabilities need to be addressed? Is the network reliant on key actors or key relationships? Are there possible changes that it could occur, such as funding or turnover, that would greatly impact the network? For example, is the network reliant on a hub that does not have sustainable funding? Drawing on the key insights from your discussion, can you determine who needs to be engaged and how they need to be engaged? What type of relationship activity, and are there certain actors more in a position to engage those actors? In addition, are there key relationships that can be leveraged to support your work or to help build more connection? Are there other key relationships that don't currently exist that need to be developed? These are just some example questions, but share any other thoughts you have about what the network structure suggests about what your group needs to do to improve the system. Now that you have identified what needs to happen, focus on ideas about how to make that happen. What are ways that those actors could be engaged, relationships leveraged, or relationships developed? Identify 2 to 3 ideas for ways to build those relationships. Then, consider who would be able to support the implementation of those ideas, especially considering those already involved in your group. Resources are, of course, necessary to support implementation of any ideas. So what resources are needed to support the implementation of your ideas? Are these resources available or feasible? Now that you have considered resources, which ideas stand out as a way to build the relationships that could strengthen the system, but can also be supported by the resources available? Which ideas are best for later down the road? Before concluding, identify one short-term goal and next step that your group would be willing to commit to, noting how that short-term goal and step would align with long-term goals and steps. In the social connectivity in the neighborhood case example, a discussion of the network plots produced a few insights about their network. One strength of the network is that a number of connections already exist between several of the organizations important to the work. In addition, one actor, AA12, is central and helping to connect many other organizations, and this actor is one committed to the work of the group. The group also identified a couple of weaknesses. One potential vulnerability is that one central actor, BB13, would be relocating out of the area in the near future, which could mean that its role in the work or in connecting with so many of the other organizations may not be easy to sustain. In addition, though the image included here is information sharing, advocacy was one of the other activities analyzed, and it was noted that missing are the public officials that could be a key target or resource in regard to any advocacy efforts. The discussion of the network plots for this case led to a number of varied reactions from the workshop participants, which is typical. Many participants offered ideas about what to do next. Some offered resources, and others needed more time to process. I've included here a sample of these various responses. We have an opportunity for funding to work on next steps. I want a contact list. We've met people we didn't previously know today. I'd like to be able to share resources quickly. I would like to gather the list of nonprofits who operate in our web neighborhood and maybe put them on our website. We could have a service provider speed dating thing, so we get time one-on-one to network. Arts and culture and community building are the two opportunities we are focused on. We have the community relationships thing, but not the technical thing. It could be about community building. It's hard to commit to a larger project right now. I want to take the knowledge I've gained today and make meaningful connections bit by bit. But ultimately, the group settled onto a next step with ideas about what the goal would be in the short term. They decided to hold an event in 3 months with flip charts on the wall with ideas that have emerged here, and people could write on the papers on the walls. And the full group was tasked with inviting other people to attend this workshop. This concludes the Systems Tools S&A training series. We hope you find the ideas and activities presented in this series helpful to your community group as you move forward with tackling complex problems. Thank you.